The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on the agenda.
Underfunding higher education in Ontario is a thoroughly pan-partisan affair. In the 40 years since you covered that with Bill Davis, I think there were only 2 years during the McGuinty period when Ontario climbed up into 9th place.
Then, later.
When people think of food banks or food insecurity, they often think of it as a food issue, but realistically it's an income issue. So it's people not having sufficient income to be able to afford their most basic necessities.
In the past few months, troubling news about the financial health of Ontario's post-secondary institutions has come to light. Many colleges and universities face serious deficits in the year to come. And after the federal government announced a cap on international students who pay inflated tuitions, well, that made the situation even worse. With us now to help wrap our heads around all of this, let's welcome, in Waterloo, Ontario, Jeff Casello. He's Associate Vice President of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs and a professor at the University of Waterloo. And here in our studio, Ann Sado, President Emeritus of George Brown College, and Alex Usher, who's the CEO of Higher Education Strategy Associates. Great to have you two here in our studio. And Jeff, nice to have you on the line as well from Waterloo for our program tonight. Let's start, and I know we could spend a half an hour talking about why all this is happening, but let's just get a bit of a checklist going and start us off. Why are things at the moment fiscally far more dire than they seem to have been in years and years and years?
Well, I think in a nutshell, I'd say a chronic or years of chronic underfunding. And this isn't new. This is many governments. I think the last major investment in post-secondary education came after the Ray Review, which was in the McGuinty era, 2004, 2005. Then that was cut back. Tuitions have been cut back. 2019, 10%, frozen ever since. It goes on and on. Operating grants, if you look at funding formulas, the amount that they recognize that programs need to be funding, frozen for at least 15 years. So I think it's just a case of years and years, chronic underfunding, lack of recognition of what the system needs, and we are where we are.
Jeff, what would you add to that list?
Yeah, just Steve, that we've gone through a period of hyperinflation now, and like everyone else, the forces on our delivery of education, it costs more to educate Ontarians and educate students, and of course, there hasn't been any response in the amount of support that we've received from government.
Well, okay, let me try this then, Alex. I remember covering Queen's Park in the early 1980s, and people were protesting at Queen's Park because even under the sainted Bill Davis government, post-secondary education funding per student was 10th out of 10 provinces then. It's 10th out of 10 provinces today. Has all that much really changed?
Underfunding higher education in Ontario is a thoroughly pan-partisan affair. In the 40 years since you covered that with Bill Davis, I think there were only 2 years during the McGuinty period when Ontario climbed up into 9th place. For Ontario to reach 9th place now would take $4 billion a year. And to reach the national average, or the average of the 9 provinces, would take about $7 billion a year. That's how badly it's underfunded in this province compared to the rest of Canada.
And the obvious conclusion I'm drawing from that is we're not about to see $4 billion injected into the system this year.
Not that I've heard.
So we are where we are.
Yeah.
All right, these are your charts, Alex, so I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring the first one up. This is how post-secondary institutions realize their revenue. And we're admittedly going back a couple of years here for this information. But this is income by source, post-secondary revenue, and since around, I'll just sort of read this in a bit of detail so those listening on podcast can hear. Since about 2010, government funds have been flat, while other sources of revenue, say from students or other sources, have risen steadily. And Alex, since these are your numbers, maybe just do a little deeper dive on the significance of this chart.
Sure. The chart here shows Canada. If you just took the Ontario numbers, it's exaggerated, right? So Ontario is very different from the rest of the country in that there is more money coming in to the system from students than there is from government. And that's not true in most of the rest of the country. Since 2011, the 100% of net new revenue in Ontario post-secondary has come from international students.
100%
of net new real revenue. Yeah, once you take care of inflation, that's the. So I say, whenever I go to a college or a university, I say, if you've had a raise in the last 12 years, if you've hired any new staff in the last 12 years, thank an international student, because that's the only place that the money's coming from. Tuition has come back down to 2011, 2012 levels. Government funding has been frozen in nominal dollars and declined by 28% after inflation in the last 10 years. I'm not sure where else institutions are supposed to get the money.
So, Jeff, just give us a sense about what that looks like on your actual campus.
Yeah, thanks. So, there was a time when government grant would have constituted quite a lot of our operating budget, but on a year-over-year basis, in real dollars, the amount of government grant that we receive for our students has decreased year over year, and that was before we had the tuition rollback. Maybe I could just give you an analogy, Steve. The government is eager, and we applaud the government to bring electric battery companies to Ontario. We see a public good in that, so we're investing in it. And now imagine that 20 years forward, the government systematically and perpetually decreases the amount of support that they provide to those battery companies. Now imagine that the government tells the battery companies how much revenue they can generate by selling their batteries, and then go to the final step and say, imagine that the government tells you to whom you can and cannot sell your batteries and actually reduces other buyers for your batteries. All of this seems like it is not in the public interest any longer. We've recognized for decades the value of public education, and at Waterloo and like in every other post-secondary institution across the province, we're struggling. And it's not a matter of us not being careful stewards, because we certainly are, but it's important that we just are not able to continue to function as this battery company would with controls on our revenue streams just across the board.
All right, and let me ask you about other sources of income, because I suspect there are people watching this or listening to this right now who are accustomed to seeing very wealthy people give tens of millions of dollars to post-secondary institutions to have their names put on buildings. And there seems to be just a great deal of, you sure look like you've got money coming in all the time from rich people. So how can you be in so much financial trouble?
Well, first of all, I'd tell you that I don't believe that that's true. I mean, universities in general do better in fundraising than colleges do, because they've been around a lot longer. And colleges operate in much smaller communities. If you look at Ontario, we've been around less than 60 years, don't have that same group of people. And when people do give money, and we've been very fortunate. When I was at George Brown, we had some very philanthropic donors who did support our needs, but they were largely capital and infrastructure needs.
Not operating.
That's right. Most donors don't want to support operating. The other thing that they do support, and institutions have been very successful in this, is creating endowments for student support. So we realize that there are very many students who don't have the means to pursue a post-secondary education without government supports. Any kind of a scholarship, a bursary that generates funds to support the students is right-headed. And a lot of donors have supported that. But it doesn't help you on the operating side.
Gotcha. Let's just, again, do a little background here, because one of the fascinating things that recently happened was the province of Ontario appointed a so-called blue ribbon panel to take a look at all of the stuff we're talking about tonight. And the blue ribbon panel recently reported, and actually kind of agrees with everything you're saying. Sheldon, bring the chart up. Let's go through this. Last year, Ministry of Colleges and Universities asked this panel to look at the sector. Here's what they found. For the years 2021-2022, compared to the rest of Canada, Ontario's funding per college student was 44%. Per university student, it was 57%. Next board. In 2020-2021, international students generated an average of 31% of revenues for colleges, less than 20% for universities. All right, let's go through this now. The significance thereof, Alex, of these numbers that we've just shared.
Well, I think the 44 and 57 is actually a comparison to other provinces. That is the for every dollar per student spent in the rest of the country, Ontario spends 44 cents.
Right.
For every dollar another province spends on universities, Ontario spends 57 cents. So it just gives you, it's another way of showing the data about how
behind we are.
How behind we are, exactly. I mean, I think that when you talk about underfunding in this province, you have to get your head around the notion that we've built an incredibly resilient system, I think. And it's a world-class system, right? University of Toronto is one of the most amazing universities in the world. It's the largest Anglophone university, or largest university in the Anglophone world. We have a college system that I think is better than any in the world. We just don't want to pay for these things, right? I mean,
Who's the we?
I think it's Ontario. I mean, I don't think you go 38 out of 40 years being 10th out of 10 without that having a lot of popular support. I don't think any political party has really made the case for higher funding for post-secondary education. They've made the case for cheaper education, right? We don't want our students to pay so much, and that is, there's been a fair bit of that, right? And the Ford government has reduced fees quite a bit in real terms. But I think there's a real popular will question here that we have to think about. It's not just political parties.
Let me pick up on the international student angle here, because, and again, Sheldon, I'm on page 3 right now. The federal government recently made this announcement about capping international students coming to this province and this country. And shall we bring the graph up here? This is middle of page 3. The graph showing Ontario in terms of where it finds its revenue with government grants versus domestic and international students. Big dip on the right-hand side, domestic tuition revenue in 2019 and going down. Moderate decline in government funding, but a higher proportion of revenue coming from international students over the years. And Alex told you earlier just how dependent we are, or have become, on that source of income. So again, Jeff, going to you here. Now that the federal government has decided we're going to take many fewer international students to come to this country and attend our post-secondary institutions, what does that look like on the ground for you?
Yeah, at Waterloo, Steve, the number of international students we've admitted over the last 5 years has actually remained relatively constant, hasn't changed. And in fact, through the pandemic, we actually had a slight decline in our international students. Now, it is true, of course, that there's much more financial flexibility in terms of the tuition setting. And again, I think to Alex's point, we have students from around the world who want to come to Canada because it's an incredible place to be a graduate student or an undergraduate student. They come here because it is a pathway for economic mobility for them, for themselves, and also that Canada is an incredibly welcoming place, Steve. You know, if we compare what's happened in the last decade in terms of welcomeness to international students in North America, certainly Canada looks very, very strong in that space. And so we have the opportunity to educate, to provide mobility for those who are coming from around the world. At Waterloo, that's been a modest number, but we really, I mean, we all derive benefit from them arriving with us in providing that education to them. And the fact that it provides some financial flexibility is certainly necessary in the economic climate we're working in.
When you were at George Brown, when you were president of George Brown, any guess about what percentage of your students were from outside Canada?
I know exactly how many there were.
Tell
it was
us.
about 27%.
Okay, that feels like a big number.
It wasn't the biggest number.
Some were 50, 75, and 90.
Yeah, they were much higher than that, but we did have to grow it. And it did grow because we also went through a phase where the demographics of domestic students was lower. Yeah. And that's changing now. Like if you look at 2023, I think we're going to have the highest number of 18 to 20-year-olds than we've had in 10 years. So demographics are changing and they're coming back. But when you have $2,700 on average per year for a diploma student
from
tuition,
Ontario?
An average student in Ontario pays $2,700 per year in tuition. That's not very much.
And a foreign student pays?
Probably about $12,000 to $15,000, depending on the program. If they're in a degree program, it's more expensive. So, but it's very low. $2,700 is very low. And to increase that modestly and to continue to get some flow of funds, you also have to remember, Steve, that there was a time when we were allowed to increase tuition by 5% as a peak. Universities had the same 5% and colleges had the same 5%. But when you're increasing 5% on $7,500 a year versus $2,500 a year, at 5%, that gap continues to grow over time. And so the college system, especially, I think, has fallen further and further behind. And I think we're the only constituency in Canada that between government grant and tuition gets less than $10,000 a year per student. That doesn't even cover the cost for domestic students of education.
So give us the big picture then, Alex. If you are saying, as the federal government is, that we're not going to let you bring as many foreign students into the country who pay 4 and 5 times the tuition that domestic students pay, that's a lot less revenue being realized. What are these post-secondary institutions supposed to do?
Well, It's going to depend a lot on how the provincial government chooses to implement the cuts. Okay, so this is a federal cut. What the federal government has said is we're going to reduce the number of total visa students coming in, and we're going to apportion those students to each province by demographic weight, basically. So Ontario gets 40%, but Ontario was taking in about 70% of the international students, okay? Mainly through the community colleges, mainly through what are called public-private partnerships, so private colleges teaching on behalf of public colleges, mainly non-GTA colleges teaching in the GTA. So the question is now we've got to get rid of, I'm forgetting the number now, but it's around 150,000 spots. How do you distribute that? That's up to the provincial government. And we don't know how that's going to be distributed. The universities will say, listen, we didn't have this huge increase in student numbers. It shouldn't be balanced on our back. The colleges will say the same thing, right? So there's going to be some back and forth. And of course, master's students and PhD students are excluded from the caps altogether. So some places like University of Toronto are going to be a little bit sheltered from this. We don't know. I mean, for the sector as a whole, it's brutal. It's $2 billion.
I was just going to say, and if you take that $2 billion and you divide it amongst all these, whatever, 4 dozen post-secondary institutions in however way you are doing it, it's several $1 million to the bottom line of many institutions.
Yes.
What are they, do they fire people, or what are they supposed to do?
In the case of those institutions that have public-private partnerships, they'll just dissolve the public-private partnership. And so, yes, there will be jobs lost, but they won't be core jobs at the public institution.
Course is canceled?
Campus is closed.
Campus is closed. Jeff, follow up if you would.
Yeah, I just want to jump in, Stephen, and say, if you look at what's happened here in Waterloo region, we had an influx of 10,000 new international students. And again, Waterloo's numbers have been constant. And so we have 10,000 new international students, all of whom are coming to Waterloo looking for the same kind of housing on top of an already rapidly growing area. And now you've got this demand for housing that can't be met, that's pushing prices up. And the students are not getting housed at their academic institutions. They're not getting support for basics. And now we have students who are, really scraping by in our community. And the government was right, I think, to question the number of international students in the capacity of institutions to be able to provide supports for these students. But I think the blunt instrument of saying we're taking away 150,000 of these spaces in Ontario, and we're going to distribute them in some opaque formula that really doesn't take into account institutions' capacities to support these students, and the evidence of how well we have supported them in the past is really problematic from the university's perspective.
Anne, what would you say?
I would agree with the blunt instrument. I mean, I think it's not all institutions are in the same place. I think the public-private partnerships have exacerbated the situation, but I'll also say that even when there was investments in those couple of years back in the early 2000s in post-secondary education, and the system looked healthy, small and rural colleges were having a challenge. And I imagine that smaller and more rural universities, even though there's not as many of them. And the whole premise of the college system, when David started, and I fundamentally support this, is that there was a local opportunity for post-secondary education. So a lot of the students that go to those schools in the smaller communities live in those communities. They don't attract the same number of international students. When there's nowhere to go because tuition is frozen or operating grants are frozen, international was the way. And I still fundamentally feel that recruiting international students is a good thing for Canada, Ontario and Canada. We need them for our labor market needs, and they're a great pathway. And again, it's always a balance, right? When things get out of balance, things are skewed, and then reactions are made at a policy level that sometimes do react either to extreme situations or to the bad players.
But Jeff, I'm going to pick up on with you on this one, and that is that one of the reasons that the federal government has decided to cut back the number of foreign students who can come here, they say, is that these foreign students are putting added pressure on our housing accommodation market right now, and we're having a tough enough time housing people who live here already. On the ground, as you look at it, does that argument hold water?
Yeah, I think it's totally fair. At the University of Waterloo, we have a first-year housing guarantee. If you come to us from Kitchener, or if you come from India, or if you come from Brazil, you are guaranteed a spot to live at the University of Waterloo in your first year. And then our region has had the capacity to move these students into private housing, some of the housing that we own off campus, and so on. And so that alternative has existed. But again, when you add 1 to 2% of the population in the region of Waterloo, all international students, all in the same sector, that becomes problematic for us. We spend at the university an enormous amount of money on supports for our student, again, international and domestic. We make sure that they have wellness, we make sure that they have housing, and all of those things. So the wraparound care that we provide for our students is just different in the university sector than it is in many of the other post-secondary education sectors.
Yeah.
But can I say that I think it's a little bit simplistic to put the housing crisis on the back of international students. I can understand that in smaller, in smaller communities, it makes more of a difference. And yes, there is a housing crisis, but I've got to tell you, the type of housing that students seek out, which is not the high-end housing, will not answer. The lack of family housing, etc., won't be answered just because you're going to reduce significantly the number of students, and just because they're gone, we're still going to have a housing crisis. So I don't think it's fair to blame that. And remember, our federal government was encouraging immigration. And so,
until recently.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be on the backs of the institutions as well, who had no choice. And again, things have to be in equilibrium, and maybe they're a little bit skewed right now, and therefore the reaction. But I think it is a blunt instrument, not to mention the fact that with an exemption for university graduate students and not anything on the college side.
And you're feeling put upon.
A little bit, because the sector educates a lot of people that we do need for our labor market in areas like healthcare that are lacking in the resources they need.
Alex, I'm going to give you the first kick at this. We did invite, not that I'm not delighted that you three are here, but we were hoping a fourth person would join us, and that person was the Minister of Colleges and Universities for the province of Ontario, Jill Dunlop. Her office said she was unable to attend, but she says, "We have been carefully reviewing the Blue Ribbon Panel's recommendations as we focus on creating a sustainable path forward and improving the financial sustainability of post-secondary institutions. As this review process continues, the government will work closely with the sector to reach an outcome that provides stability and certainty for post-secondary institutions and students alike, with further details to be announced by the end of February." You want to translate what that means in your judgment, Alex?
She's had the Blue Ribbon Panel report since late August,
right?
Mid-August.
Months.
There's been no sign to my knowledge that there's any significant investment coming. I think this is one of those files where the government wants to look like it's doing something rather than actually achieving something. So I imagine there will be some money. I think we've heard that there is some money in the offing. We've heard from the Premier that he does not want to follow the Blue Ribbon Panel's recommendation on higher tuition. And tuition is a bigger portion of the budget than the grant money. Again, I mean, how do you? If they're going to say, look, we're going to raise we're going to raise grants to institutions by a percentage point or two, doesn't change a thing. Doesn't change. It doesn't even come close to dealing with what the Blue Ribbon Panel said, and certainly doesn't come close to making up for what's about to happen here with the Cap One international students.
Jeff, I know it might make you unpopular, but tuition has been frozen for 5.5 years at 2018 levels. In your judgment, does that freeze have to end?
It has to end, Steve. I think that, if you look around the world at how much tuition students pay for post-secondary education, let's start in the U.S. And in the U.S., we have these sort of very well-endowed universities that can offer higher education at a rate that is consistent with what a family is able to pay. And so I went to a university way back in 1988 where the tuition was $35,000. At the time, my family was a very blue-collar family. We paid $2,800 out of pocket per year because the university had the support to be able to do that. If you go to Europe, there is typically no charge for tuition. If you are a German student, if you are a Dutch student and you want to attend a university in those countries, you don't pay tuition because the government finds so much value in providing that support. In Canada, where we've landed is we want the students to share the responsibility for tuition with government. And if the costs increase year over year, there has to be pathways for the revenue streams to come into these universities and to the colleges to be able to provide that education. And again, I just go back to the fundamental premise that we all agree that education and having an educated workforce is good for society. And so the government ought to share that responsibility with those who are being educated. That's the premise we've been operating on for 100 years in Ontario. And this has been a major, I think, move away from that in terms of the government contribution in the last 7 years. And yeah, I won't be popular, but I do think we ought to have increases in tuition to make sure that these universities and colleges stay sustainable.
All right, we're going to give our friend from out of town the last word on this one. I want to thank the three of you for coming into TVO tonight and helping us understand this issue, which, as you point out, Alex, has only been going on for about 40 or 50 years in this province, and I'm sure one day they'll get the hang of it. Where's our shot? There we go. Ann Sato, the former president of George Brown College, Alex Usher, CEO of Higher Education Strategy Associates, Jeff Casello, the professor and associate vice president, graduate and postdoctoral affairs at the University of Waterloo. Great to have the three of you on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Food security was a big topic at the Rural Ontario Municipal Association's conference last month. I spoke with local leaders about the issues and solutions to feeding Ontarians.
Food security in this province starts in rural Ontario, but that's not always keeping people there well fed. Here to discuss how rural municipalities, community organizations, and the agricultural sector can come together to help, Drew Spolstra, President of Agriculture, Carolyn Stewart, CEO of Feed Ontario, Sarah Epp, Assistant Professor in Rural Planning and Development at the University of Guelph, and Christine McDonald, Chief Administrative Officer of Bruce County. Welcome all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Carolyn, I'm going to start with you. Sure. I'd like you to sort of paint a picture, a provincial picture for us. What is food security like right now across this province?
It's very challenging for Ontarians right now. You know, we've seen the highest number of food bank users on record ever. In the last year alone, food bank use in this province has increased 38%, topping 800,000 people accessing services over almost 6 million times. So that's a staggering number for us. And really there's a lot of key drivers to that. You know, I think we can all understand that the economy is shifting. It's making it incredibly difficult. The quality of work, and for people in rural communities, they feel certain pressures even more. You know, when we talk about access to food, distance to accessing food, as well as things like cost of housing, access to rental housing, which is definitely a driver. And for those living on a limited income, like people on social supports, when the cost of food and inflation and just the realities of post-pandemic life, it's just the cost of living is getting increasingly out of reach for so many people. And we're seeing the realities play out at food banks and social services across the province.
All right, there's obviously going to be some words that we're going to throw out here, but I do want you to define something for me. What does food insecurity mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, really when someone is food secure, when they have sufficient access to nutritious, affordable food that's culturally appropriate and accessible both from geographical distance, but also what they need, when they need it. And so for us, I think sometimes when people think of food banks or food insecurity, they often think of it as a food issue, but realistically it's an income issue. So it's people not having sufficient income to be able to afford their most basic necessities. And so I think that plays out in so many different ways, and we're just one piece of the food insecurity chain. Obviously there's expertise from all different areas on this panel today, but for us, what we're seeing is people really struggling with more severe insecurity. You know, when we look at Canadians, we now see 25% of Canadians are now considered food insecure, or sorry, 20% of Canadians are now considered food insecure. So that's people struggling, so they either miss a meal, they might think about missing a meal, or it might be several days without food. So that in a country like Canada, in a province like Ontario, where we're fortunate to have so much great food grown, having people not able to access something as core to our being as food is devastating.
All right, so we got the provincial lens. Christine, I'm coming to you. You're joining us from Bruce County, of course. Paint us that picture. What does food security look like in your region?
Sure. So I would echo many of the comments that were made in terms of the increased need for it. We partner with a number of our human-serving organizations in our area, our United Way, Public Health, and other human-serving organizations. And United Way in particular tracks our usage of food banks, meal programs, and so on. And we've definitely seen that increased spike in usage. With the programs that we deliver around homelessness and housing, we also know that over the last 5 years of the census period, our homelessness sheltering rates have increased by 500%, which is really significant in our rural areas to see that incredible change. And so definitely witnessing at a local level in Bruce County some of those same challenges that were mentioned provincially.
All right, Drew, the agricultural sector in Ontario is more than just farming. Help us understand what the sector looks like here in the province.
Well, I think the sector, is a vibrant, growing sector and part of, part of our communities right across the province. There's lots of things going on in agriculture, and to take it back to your previous question about food security, I think that's what a lot of farmers across this province are striving to do is decrease the reliance on food banks and increase production right across the province. We're always striving to do better. From the food insecurity piece, I think a lot of our farmers, a lot of our commodity organizations are doing their best to donate to food banks. There's milk programs that are being donated to. There's millions of pounds of chicken, beef, pork. All those things are being donated as we go along. And part of the struggle is, of course, that these are raw, perishable products in a lot of cases. And we run into processing issues, and we just don't have the ability to process those products into forms that consumers need on a timely basis.
Sarah, I'm hoping you can pick up on that in terms of the diversity of farms. Farms aren't in Ontario, not just these massive farms. Paint us that picture.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because we have this incredible mosaic of agriculture in Ontario, and I think it's important to recognize that it isn't just these large-scale, giant farms and this negative sort of context we have around this idea of a corporate farm type structure. There's farms that can be as small as an acre if you're doing market gardening or intensive greenhousing, to thousands of acres in size, and that can be a family farm or at any one of those levels. It's not just because it's a large farm, it's a giant corporate entity. It's a huge diversity, and also huge diversity in what's grown or raised on those farms, which I think is incredible and speaks to the vibrancy of agriculture in the province.
All right, Christine, I'm going to come back to you because I want you to paint that picture for us in Bruce County. What does sort of the agricultural sector look like?
Absolutely, and would echo what Sarah mentioned, that we have a wide diversity of agriculture in our region. So we do have small-scale farms. We have some interesting farmers that are entrepreneurial spirits with microgreen programs where they deliver to people's homes. And then we have large-scale family farms that actually own thousands of acres that are delivering on oil and seed around the world and internationally. So a great diversity in products that are available in types and scales of farm in our area, certainly. And so the opportunity for folks to be involved in farm gate production is an important piece, sometimes that helps with the reduction in costs. Unfortunately, a challenge for us in our area, of course, is transportation. And so sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of people being able to get to those farm gate options without a transportation system.
All right, Carolyn, help us understand this part. Food is such a big part of rural Ontario, yet rural Ontarians are faced with food insecurity. Can you please help me understand what is happening in rural Ontario?
Yeah, I think we all, especially in this room, especially like people associated with agriculture, understand that food is what brings people together. I think we can all say that. All of our big celebrations, our holiday moments are really centered around food. A birthday cake, a Thanksgiving dinner, we can all say that. But food banks experience the same thing, right? Food is what brings people through the door. It's that essential core need that brings people into food banks and why they're needed. But what's being faced across rural municipalities is really the same challenges seen across Ontario, but in certain acute ways. So access is one. So we're seeing increased access to people in food banks because in rural municipalities, there's fewer rental units available, and housing is a key driver of food bank use, so access to affordable housing. On top of that, access to cost food. So in some communities, they don't even have grocery stores, particularly if we're talking northern and remote communities. So higher food prices, longer distances to access the type of food that you want, potentially the culturally appropriate or, you know, diet specific food that you want. And then on top of that, we're talking about employment, access to proper employment that allows you to be able to afford your most basic necessities, that prevents you from needing to come to a food bank. So when we have all of these things combined, it's really driving people to be in need of services. And unfortunately, food is the one thing people can choose to go without, in the sense that I can choose to keep a roof over my head, or I can go to the food bank where I know there's a resource. I have to keep my heat on, or I can go to the food bank for help. So in a lot of, when we're talking about food bank clients, most people only have $100 left at the end of the month after paying for housing. So you can imagine $100 left to pay for all of your most basic necessities. And when you're in rural communities, if you have to own a car, you have to travel great distances, you have to pay for gas to access even employment. You know, the largest growing group and fastest rising group of food bank users is actually employed people. So in the last year alone, we've seen a 38% increase in employed people accessing food banks. So that's really showing the changing demographic and needs across the province and what's contributing to food insecurity.
All right. As we talk about the demographics, of course, of changing in food banks and sort of changing communities overall, I want to talk about the demographics in the agricultural sector. So Drew, according to Stats Canada, in 2021's agricultural census, the proportion of farmer operators above the age of 55 is growing while the number of younger farmers is decreasing. What are some of the biggest challenges for generational farming as a generational farmer yourself?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of challenges and really barriers to getting into farming. I think that's part of the struggle that young farmers see. You know, as you mentioned, there's you know, a growing segment of the industry that is getting older. There are new farmers coming in, but that has to, in a lot of cases, work through succession planning, and those are difficult, timely, challenging issues to try and work through when it comes to succession planning. So, you know, certainly one of the barriers to getting into the business is the cost, and you know, we're dealing with in an industry that has high risk, high reward, high costs to get into the business. We're also dealing with high land values and a lot of pressure on land across the province and across, you know, many parts of the country as well. So that really creates quite a few barriers when we look at land costs and just getting into the industry in general.
All right, Sarah, I see you nodding your head. I want you to pick up on that. Why would some younger generations, even those who are new to rural areas who say, hey, maybe this is something that I want to do and genuinely have the interest of farming, find it challenging to get in? What are the obstacles?
A lot of obstacles, and I want to stress too, though, a lot of opportunity. I think it's really interesting to see. I think we always think generational farmers, but there's so many new entrants into farming that have no connection to agriculture. They don't have a farm to inherit. They didn't grow up on a farm. We saw that during the sort of peak of the pandemic in particular, and the minister sort of alluded to this migration to rural communities. And so the talk of urbanites, if we can, sort of getting into farming was incredible, because there was this sort of move into rural places because they offered a lot of social well-being and health benefits to be out of the city potentially and into these more rural communities. And so this interest of growing food is sort of in a renaissance, I think, for those who don't have that connection. It is an absolutely rewarding career. I want to stress that. I think we hear so much about the challenges in agriculture, which there are lots, and barriers such as cost and all these other things, but there's a drive because it is rewarding and it is something that people have a passion for. You don't get into agriculture unless you have some sort of passion for that career. You don't just sort of stumble into into it and give it a try, because as Drew noted, it's really expensive. So it isn't something you can just try for a year and then maybe decide to go into something else. But I think it is this really interesting connection of those who have no link to farming, and they tend to be in any age category as well. We're not finding that it's just a 20-year-old sort of getting into agriculture because it's an interest. It's this whole spectrum of folks that have maybe no connection to agriculture who want to get into the industry because they see the value of it.
Christine, I do want to pick up on some stuff that you had mentioned as well. You had talked about transportation, but I want to talk about some social supports. What kinds of social supports are usually missing in your community and maybe other rural communities?
Well, it's an interesting question. Transportation does play into it, but then we have, there is a lot of hopefulness as well too, because we have really creative people that put together programs. And so through networking of food banks and coordination of food programs under our Food Security Action Group, you can access a food bank within 20 to 30 minutes of any part of our county, which is massive, right? It's about 2 hours long and about an hour wide. And so people, through creative collaboration, are making sure that people do have access to food. For a number of years in our county, along with Grey County, we've had a good food box program where, again, there was coordination of accessing fresh produce and then delivering it to people's homes for a very reasonable price. It started out at about $20 for a bin of produce. And so there's the creativity that allows people to access food even where there's some barriers that are quite challenging.
All right, Carolyn, I want to come to you. Talk to me about what the role of food banks play when we play in rural communities and remote communities. We talk about social supports.
Yeah, I think, I think food banks in general are part of the fabric of communities. They never wanted to be institutionalized, but unfortunately, as a response to the 80s, we still exist because there's still a need. But a lot of the times, food banks are what helps get people through the door, and then we are able to make those connections, as mentioned, to other social support programs in the area. One key thing we actually released in some recent research is the impact of social isolation on poverty, particularly for those who could live in rural communities who don't cross paths with many people often. It drastically contributes to someone's poverty levels, whether if they don't have social connection, they can't make those bridges or connections to help them get out of poverty. And so food banks are really that starting point, I think, for lots of people. And we're also often that last line of defense, to be quite honest. Oftentimes people will go through many other mechanisms before visiting a food bank. So borrowing from friends, going into debt, staying on people's couches, all of those things, because I think it's difficult for anyone to ask for help. But we want to make sure that communities, especially in rural communities where oftentimes people are at great distances, it allows them to make those connections. And so, a great example is our member in Meaford found that there was a lot of people, particularly seniors, who were dealing with food insecurity, but a lot of it related to that social isolation. So they started a seniors cafe, which allowed that drop-in for seniors to come in to access those food supports, but also connect those pieces of community. And for them, it shifted a lot for those individuals who are dealing with poverty, but also social isolation at the same time. So making those important connections, I think, is a lot of what food banks do as well.
So you've shown that side, but I want to ask, how concerning is it? Food banks were set up as it was an emergency thing. It's now sort of turned into just a part of our fabric of shopping in that sense. When we go grocery shopping, it's like, well, I can't get this, I can't afford this, I'm going to go to the food bank. It's for some people, like you had mentioned, it's an option A. How concerning is it that it's been weaved sort of into our day-to-day for a lot of people?
It's drastically concerning for us. If you ask a food banker, we would love to shut our doors. We don't want to exist. We are an emergency service provision for an emergency need. We should not exist. We exist because of failing public policies and a social safety net that's been slowly chipped away at and dismantled over 30 to 40 years. And so And we cannot exist. Like ultimately, we go back to saying we are an income issue. We exist until we don't need to. So food banks are going to be there for those who need them until such time as we're not needed. But really, it's good. It's housing is the key driver, which I know everyone in this room is experiencing at drastic levels, the housing crisis. It's jobs and proper income supports and proper job quality, so benefits, proper pay, and then on top of that, social assistance programs. So Ontario Works and both the Ontario Disability Support Program put you more than 50% below the poverty line. So they're legislating people into poverty, and there's no way to build bridges out of poverty without these connections and social supports at every level of government. So this is no one level's fault, and it's only through collaboration and connectivity at every level that we're going to make change.
All right, I want to talk social supports regarding farmers. A study out of the University of Guelph in 2022 found that mental health for farmers was worse than it was 5 years ago and worse than the general population. The research team found 76% of farmers surveyed said they were experiencing moderate to high levels of perceived stress. They cited inability for sick days. I don't know what that would look like really for farmers. That's a hard one. The lack of control for weather and other input costs. Drew, what role does mental health play when we talk about farming?
Plays a huge role. Mental health is certainly a very prominent issue on farms right across the province and other areas of the world as well. But a lot of times farmers are working in isolation. They're working by themselves. They're with themselves and their thoughts, and that's it. Or with the cows maybe too, or some other animal that's not going to talk back to them. But it is a huge issue, and it requires quite a bit of work. We're grateful that the Ontario government, along with the Canadian government, has put some dollars and investment into some mental health programs for farmers, Farmer Mental Wellness Initiative, and we've had a hand in helping advertise some of that as well. So we've been pretty grateful about that program. We'd like to see it expanded, obviously, to farm workers as well, because it's more than just the farmer itself, him or herself. We need to get everybody on the farm, able to access some of that information. It's also about social infrastructure in our communities as well. So obviously the farmer wellness is one piece, but having access to healthcare and other social services right across rural communities, it is a barrier to folks getting into the industry like I talked about before, but it's also just something that we need to move forward with proper investments right across rural Ontario.
All right. Sarah, you're not a mental health expert, but in your analysis of communities in remote and rural areas, what kinds of supports can lead to a healthier system?
It's interesting because I think when we think of rural places and remote places, although the challenges are very different in remote places, I want to stress that, and that's separate from Indigenous communities as even more strain. In rural communities, stereotypically, we felt that there was always these social supports in place. There's all these different community groups, there's all these different organizations. People in rural communities are so much more close-knit, and we have those social supports already in place. And I think a lot of that's true. The challenge is, and I think this links right back to agriculture in general, we see a lot of restructuring in the industry. And so those rural places that depend on agriculture have potentially fewer farmers, they have larger farm tracts due to farm consolidation. And when you have fewer people, you have fewer supports in place, whether it be community groups, whether it be access to different services, mental health, regular health benefits, investment in transportation. All of these things decrease when we don't have a rural population base to support them, whether in agriculture or a different community. And so I think part of the real stress and strain on this is that population loss. And we heard that there is this sort of rural renaissance happening, but that's only in certain rural places, and every rural community is different. So while some potentially based on different benefits and amenity value have seen an increase in population, many others have not experienced that, and those communities are struggling because they don't have that population base to support those services. And when you lose your population base, you lose your rural place, and you eventually just lose your community, which is incredibly disappointing and unfortunate, and it is a reality facing many rural places.
All right, Drew, we live in some of the most fertile lands that this province can offer. We are obviously, as we mentioned, we are in a housing crisis. We need to build more homes. When it comes to land use, what are some of the challenges you experience as a farmer?
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of pressure on land right across, certainly southern Ontario, but other parts of Ontario as well. And, we know only 5% of Ontario's agricultural land, or Ontario's land, is suitable for agriculture production. So, our ask is that we continue to look at farmland going forward as, one of the most important pieces to the decision-making process going forward. There's only so much of it. We're not making any more. We need to ensure that farmland stays as farmland, wherever possible. And we need to ensure that the farm and the farmer can stay sustainable going forward. So there's a huge piece that is the agriculture system. That's not just the farmer. That takes into account, dealerships, veterinarians, all the service industry, and it's great to say preserve the farmland, but you also need to preserve the farmer and the system as well.
Good point there. I want to talk for the rest of this about solutions and what we can do. Christine, I'm going to come to you. In your area, you've developed some innovative solutions to tackle food insecurity. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I'd referenced a few different things that we've done sort of as we talked earlier throughout, but I think one of the most important ways that municipalities can support food security is by offering some of the leadership and backbone sort of supports, small amounts of seed funding. We provide funding to our poverty task force locally, just $25,000 annually, and they have a number of different actions groups, food security being one of them, and are able to bring together and through in-kind supports from others, establish a lot more. And by working in partnership with, major sectors in our area, we have the agricultural sector involved in gleaning programs to support food security. Our nuclear industry, Bruce Power as our nuclear supplier and their supply chain network are often involved in fundraising efforts as well too, that contribute annually to food programs and other types of programs in our community. So by bringing different sectors together, we are able to raise some funds to support the need for food security while that still exists. And as a municipality, we can provide that leadership by bringing people together and allowing us to leverage what's already available in community.
All right. Carolyn, I want to give you all the power in the province. If I had the ability to give you all that power, what would you say is the immediate sort of thing that you would do to tackle food insecurity across Ontario?
I think there's no silver bullet, so I'm going to say that out loud, but if I had all the power in the world, social assistance recipients represent about 60% of those that we support. So those are people who are on Ontario Works or the Ontario Disability Support Program. And as I mentioned, both of them fall at least 50% below the poverty line. So even just something as straightforward as either raising social assistance rates to align with the market basket measure, or alternatively, reducing clawbacks on earned income on those programs will put a lot more money back in people's pockets and will reduce the reliance on a number of social programs. So I think that's the most direct thing I can say. For us, the other two areas of policy we really support are housing, which I think is incredibly complex, particularly for rural communities. And the other area is really labor laws, paid sick days, livable wage, equal pay for equal work, all of these things that are not currently being, and for one of the biggest thing is right now, 1 in 10 Ontarian workers is a gig worker. So they don't fall under the Employment Standards Act. So they're not covered by legislation, they're not protected workers, and we're seeing the impact of that, particularly in small communities, contract workers, things like that. So vitally important. You shouldn't have given me this time. It's a soapbox, okay?
All right, Drew, let's talk about the agricultural sector. In what ways can the sector contribute to food security across this province? Knowing that full well that you guys are doing the best you can, you guys are sort of, the backbone of it all.
I think we're doing the best we can do, but we can certainly always do better, and we're always looking to improve on our businesses and our structures, and again, just strive to do better. I think we need to look at obviously protecting our land, air, and water. Those are certainly things that we rely on. We need to ensure that farmers have tools in their toolbox. We need to make sure that we can access those tools whenever necessary, that we can continue to invest in our businesses and ensure that we have long-term sustainable planning for the future of rural Ontario, and that we know what direction we're heading in terms of farmers and farming, and how we can continue to grow going forward. I think I'd like to go back to what Christine said around partnerships. That's certainly a way that agriculture is going to move some of these initiatives forward. We can't do it alone. I can't do it alone as president of OFA, and certainly looking to work with our partners across the sector to move some of the initiatives forward around food security and how we can improve on some of those things. We need to make partnerships with municipalities as well. And we need to make sure that proper investments are made in the sector locally where possible, that we can look to reduce red tape, and that we can look to remove barriers that farmers are facing across the province.
All right, Sarah, we talked about a little bit about the roles of municipalities and provincial government and federal government. How can all levels of government work towards a solution?
It's a great question. It has to be collaborative. It can't be pitting industries against each other at various levels of government. It can't be, and we hear it play out right now, this idea of housing versus farmland, and just pitting those two against each other, I think is probably the worst thing we can do right now. And so that's at a provincial level, a local level. The federal government is a little bit different in this, but we've seen some incredible changes recently with rebates if you're building apartment buildings, rental units as an example, instead of just single detached dwellings, which we know are not affordable or accessible. And so I think there needs to be that better communication and collaboration across all levels of government, regardless of party. That shouldn't matter at this point, because we're facing a food crisis, a housing crisis, climate crisis. There's so much facing us that can make the future just seem so bleak and unbearable. Getting back into mental health as an attachment to that those three levels of government, and potentially four, depending if you're in a region, county, whatever that structure is, absolutely need to be collaborative in their approach and sort of cross those party lines and stop putting different groups against each other to sort of wind that down and muddy the waters.
I'd like to say thank you to our panelists for their insightful discussions. Please give them a lovely round of applause. Thank you so much.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
There was much media coverage in the Northern Ontario media about the fact that Sault Ste. Marie had elected a first French-speaking mayor. And it gave me the sense that something was still off amongst Francophone and Anglophone relations in the community. As the media coverage focused on that aspect of my election, it caused me to have conversations with Francophone community members, and I felt that there was still a lingering scar.
That's tomorrow on the agenda. The agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.